So the biggest struggle when it comes to getting into a card game, sometimes I would think it's more than likely starting out with a deck. Where do I begin? How do I become competitive? I don't have a lot of cards. And sometimes you're just wondering, like, what's the best way to start? Well, so MTG, our Wizards, has come out with these challenger decks every year since 2018, and they are built to be competitive right out of the box. They advertise it being ready to play in your local FNM or tournament. With that being said, guys, hey guys, it's me, Scar, coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. And today's going to be diving into the various deck lists that come with these new challenger decks that Wizards has released for 2021. And with that being said, we're going to dive into each one of the deck lists, kind of go over what each deck does, whether they are good or competitive, based on just a general approach on looking at them as a whole. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. If you're new here, wanting to post new videos like this, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into each one and let's talk about it. So the first thing I would actually like to start off, these are actually going to be physical decks that you can physically go out to your local game store or anywhere you can get Magic the Gathering product and buy off the shelf. So the only downfall with them is they actually don't come with codes to redeem into MTG Arena, but we're going to dive into each one and kind of talk about what I think overall, whether I think they're a good investment off the bat. Just to give you a little disclaimer before you go into this thinking that these are decks that are going to be released on MTG Arena. Who knows? The one thing, there is no confirmation if there's going to be a code in them, but in previous years they haven't added a code to them, so I just wanted to throw that in there before we dive into the first deck. With that out of the way, we're going to dive into the first deck, which is actually the Stompy Mono Green deck. Now, right off the bat, I actually do enjoy what I'm seeing here. There is a good swath of cards that are very competitive in green. Sure, maybe there's not, 4 copies of particular cards in the deck, but some of the ones they do go for 4 of do make it seem like they're actually serious about investing in, the deck itself and having a lot of cards. Off the bat, I actually kind of like the list. I mean, sure, it's if you were going to be a budget player, and you were going to upgrade, I'd probably upgrade to probably the more comparative mono green Stompy deck than this one. But I think this is a good start for being a player who plays physical Magic, and I think for $30, it's actually not that bad. And we're just going to go into each of the cards and kind of talk about each one and talk about it. So the first card up is Snakeskin Veil. It's a new card from Kaldheim. I actually like this card. It maybe not see a lot of play now, but I think, as there's a lot of board removal and stuff, I think it could be a good card to sneak into like a green deck or a deck that splashes green for that hexproof. And a +1/+1 counter is an added benefit that really good in that sense. Next up is Swarm Shambler. It's a 3 copies of a 1-drop, which is pretty solid. I mean, it is a rare, so having a deck, starter deck to be competitive, having a rare in it is definitely very good. Swarm Shambler is a very interesting 1-drop card for mono green in general, and the fact that it comes in the battlefield with a 1/1 counter, and then whenever a creature we control with a +1/+1 counter becomes target of a spell, an ability, an opponent controls, we get to start pumping out insects. So it makes board removal definitely very hard. And from what I can see here, there's a lot of cards in the deck that actually get +1/+1 counters, and there's ways to add additional +1/+1 counters in the later game. So I do see this being a pretty decent card, and then we can start putting +1/+1 counters on Swarm Shambler. I got Wildwood Tracker. It's a 1-of as well. And it's also another decent aggressive 1-drop for mono green currently, with it being a 1/1 that if it attacks or blocks, if we control another non-human creature, it gets +1/+1 to end of turn. So even on turn 2, if you play a non-human creature and swing in, it's already a 2/2. So 1 mana that could be a possible 2/2 when attacking or blocking is definitely, I think, very good as well. Stonecoil Serpent is pretty solid here because it's an X cost. So no matter when we draw it, it can be whatever we want it to be based on how much mana we have. So I do like that. It has protection from multicolor, and there's a decent amount of multicolor in the set. Reach, Trample, definitely a solid card. 2-of is not terrible because, it's a whatever slot, I would say. I would personally play 4, but, that's something you can probably upgrade into. But, that's something you can make later down the line as you start playing the deck and seeing if you really do enjoy it and want to upgrade it. Next card up is Primal Might. It's a card from M21. I think that lost a little bit of faith with a lot of the, you don't see as often as maybe, when it first released, but it's an interesting card in the sense that's a 1 green X. Essentially, it gives target creature control +X/+X, where X is what we paid for the X cost, and it makes 1 creature we control fight up to 1 creature we don't control. So even if you don't pay anything for the X, you can still fight another creature for 1, which I do think this is a good card. Or you can put it on a creature and make it very big, maybe kill their only blocker, and swing in for big damage with the creature you are fighting with. So definitely a very diverse card, and it can do a lot or a little depending on how you want to play it. But Definitely a good card, and I do like that there's 3 copies of it, so definitely a good amount to be, you know, with some decent removal. After that, we got Ram Through, 2 mana card that, you know, deals combat damage to equal to its power to target creature we don't control. So it's not a fight spell essentially, but we can direct damage to a creature we just want to get removed of. And if our creature has trample, it does the over damage to that creature's controller as well. So definitely a good card in that sense. And 2 mana and having 4 copies of, I actually do like seeing that many copies of in the deck. Next card up is Scavenge and Ooze. You know, solid card. Definitely, there's a lot of things that get put in the graveyard. You know, this get rid of your opponents like Rakdos or things they can escape out of the graveyard. So definitely a good card in that sense. Also good if you're playing against rogues. You can start eating your own creatures that get milled into the graveyard and make this thing bigger. It definitely gets itself out of the way of something like a Heartless Act. But I think I like 2 copies. I mean, maybe it's not enough for the 2-drop slot, as I can see our 2-drop slot's a little bit on the later side. But I do like the fact they put 2 of this in the deck. So definitely a good card in that sense. Next card up is Wildborn Preserver. It's another 2 mana creature with flash. So we can play it at the end of our opponent's turn to kind of surprise them with it. Also, we can play if they attack with a small, you know, creature in the air, we can also flash it in and possibly block it. And then whenever we play a non-human creature on the battlefield, we can pay X, and if we do, we put X +1/+1 counters on it, which is good, you know, synergy as well. I should say anything that gets a +1/+1 counter with our Swarm Shambler. So definitely good synergy there. So it definitely makes it hard to get removed with a direct removal spell because we'll get a 1/1 out of it. So overall, pretty good card. 2 copies of is probably good as well. I think they're balancing the 2 rares in this slot, you know, 2 of each. Moving on to the next one, we got Sir Farron, the Henchhammer. 2 green, 2/2. When it attacks, another creature we control gets +X/+X for telling the term X is Sir Farron's power. So off the bat, you know, you're gonna give target creature +2/+2 as long as this attacks in. With it, but I mean, there's ways I would say in the deck that you could probably add additional +1/+1 counter. There aren't many. Really, Snakeskin Veil is the only one. But I mean, the possibility of giving a +X/+X is always good. Getting that 2 additional damage is pretty good as well. We also do have Garrick in the deck, so you can give it +3/+3 and give it trample, and then give something +5/+5, which could be very game breaking. But overall, pretty good card to have 2 of in the deck, and I do. Maybe our 2-drop slot is a little bit light. There's definitely a good chance to possibly miss some 2-drops, but I think it's okay for what we're where we're curving out with this deck. So definitely an okay, I think, 2-drop curve. Next up is Love Struck Beast. Actually, already surprised right off the bat that there's 4 copies in the list as well. You know, a 3 mana 5/5 with the ability to create a 1/1 token to make it allow it to attack in, because we can't attack unless we control a 1/1 creature. So overall, pretty good card in that sense. Even if you can't attack, if they destroy your 1/1 or you don't have a 1/1, you can always still have a nice 5/5 blocker. 5/5 body for 3 mana is very solid. And definitely something that, you know, your opponent has to deal with or get out of the way. We can also use it to fight spells, even if it can't attack. So, you know, you can have a Primal Might or a Ram Through played on it and just deal that damage to your opponent. So good in that sense, I would say. Then we got Kazu Mammoth. You know, solid 3-drop here, 3/3 with landfall ability. Sure, the deck doesn't play any like things to kind of, you know, put 2 lands in the battlefield on the same turn, like Evolve on Wilds or even Fabled Passage, because it's mono green. But the idea of getting, you know, a possible 5/5 is good in that sense. So I do like that for the 3-drop slot. And also, in the worst case scenario, you can always play it on the battlefield as a land. Though it does come in the battlefield tapped. So definitely a good diverse card in the 3-drop slot. Next card up is Thrash and Brontodon. It's a 3 mana 3/4 with the ability to sacrifice and destroy target artifact or enchantment. This is probably, I would say, one of the weaker of the 3-drops, just on the basis of, sure, it's an okay ability to have, but it doesn't really do much other than the possibility of destroying an artifact or enchantment. And if your opponent doesn't really have that, then it's just a nice 3/4 body. But for 3 mana, I would say having a 3/4 body is okay. But, you know, there's something to be desired a little bit more, maybe something more on the mono green, like fight spells or something that has a little bit more fight to it. But, you know, it is what it is. I do think they were going for a certain price point, and I feel like this is okay, I guess, to fit that price point node. Then we got Yorvo of the Garen Brig. It's a 3 mana 4/4 because it comes to the battlefield 4/4 4 +1/+1 counters on it. And whenever we play another green creature on the battlefield, it gets +1/+1 counter. So he gets bigger and bigger the more creatures we play on the battlefield. And then if that creature is greater than Yorvo's would die, you have to put another +1/+1 counter on Yorvo. So it grows in multitudes of ways, but typically you're just going to grow it based on putting more and more green creatures. I do like that there's 2 of this because they do play a lot of rares here. So it's okay that I think it's that they play 2 of these, and it's also legendary, so you can only have 1 on the battlefield as well. Next card up is Gemraiser. So Gem Razor is a pretty solid card here. Yet again, more artifact or enchantment removal, so I don't really know if there's a lot of it. I know there's some sagas that are currently going around on the meta as a whole, but I'm not really sure if, you know, having all that enchantment and artifact removal, I would say you probably could just have dealt with, you know, Gem Razors and maybe just do an additional copy. Just because Gem Razor can also be played for 3 mana as long as you have a creature, because you can mutate it onto that creature to do the ability. It also has reach, it also has trample, which also makes it a very good thing to put on something with a +1/+1 counters on it. So essentially, you know, you add this onto like a Yorvo or something like that, it becomes a 4/4, and then with the 4 additional +1/+1 counters, so it becomes an 8/8 reach trampler. So definitely a good card in that sense, and having the ability to you know, destroy artifacts or enchantments by mutating is good as well. Next up is Garruk Unleashed. This is only a 1-of in the deck, which is kind of interesting that they only went with a 1-of on the Planeswalker. But I get that it's mythic compared to all the other rares. I do like the idea that, you know, you can put +3/+3 on target creature and give it trample for +1. You can -2 and get a 3/3 beast creature token. And then if you control more creatures, then you get to put a loyalty counter back on Garruk. So essentially it only costs you -1. And the -7 is you get an emblem at the beginning of your end step. You may search your library for a creature card, put it on the battlefield, and shuffle your library. But I do like the +1 ability for this deck, because the deck is very low, and then getting this on turn 4 on curve would be very nice, because it gives any of our creatures we played earlier, you know, +2/+3 and trample, which could be very, you know, game changing, or pretty much take our opponent out of their misery at this point. But overall, pretty good card. I would say you would need more copies eventually, maybe like 2 or 3 of at most in the deck, just because I feel like this is something I would want to try to hit with, especially with our creatures that we do play in the lower end. And then we got the Turn Timber Symbiosis. This is also a 2-of, which is actually pretty good compared to like the Garruk. I like the idea that it can play as a land, as we do play limited mana base in the deck, by paying the 3 life or just coming to the battlefield tap. And then we can also pay 7 and look at the top 7 cards of our library. We can put a creature card among them onto the battlefield. If that creature may cost us 3 or less, we have to enter with 3 additional +1/+1 counters on it, and then put the rest on the bottom of our library. And essentially our deck is a lot of, you know, 3 or less creatures other than the Gem Razor. So you are going to hit more than likely a creature that costs 3 or less and put additional counters on it. There's some that are better to be desired in the 3-drop slot. You know, I would like to hit a Yorvo, like to hit a Mammoth, possibly a Lovestruck Beast. But the problem is, if you don't have a 1/1 on it, you know, you're not going to be able to attack him with your 8/8 Lovestruck Beast. But I do like the fact that they are given like a card to dig a little bit deeper, get a little bit aggressive, get a lot of creatures on the battlefield, and, you know, you just overwhelm your opponent with large creatures. And then we're playing 19 lands, which is interesting here. I mean, like I said, our curve isn't very high. I think we average around like 2.3 or 2.4 if you actually go to here. Yeah, 2.3. So we don't need a lot of lands, and we do have modal cards just in case we don't draw lands. But I do sometimes put, like, at that risk, I guess we are playing 24 lands, but we would have to sacrifice one of our spells in order to do so. So there's a possibility that I would think that I would rather play like 20 or 21 lands and maybe cut back on, you know, a creature or 2. Because there are things that we could probably cut out that probably just, you know, that we don't need a ton of copies of. But I mean, overall, I mean, right off the bat, out of the box, I would say this is definitely very competitive. I didn't actually copy in the sideboards, but the sideboards I would say are probably competitive for the way, you know, the meta is as a whole. Because just as a general standpoint, most of these decks are pretty meta like style decks that kind of fit in with like some of the decks that would be in their color scheme in the meta as a whole. Let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. So this next deck is actually fairly interesting right off the bat, as it's being a Azorius control deck, which is always interesting with the way the meta is. Now, you would probably think in your head that, you know, control is not great if you play a lot of best of 1, just because it's a little bit slower. A lot of the cards come in the battlefield a little bit slower, so, you know, best of 1 meta is very aggressive. But I would actually think there's probably that there's probably a hole in like the best of, you know, the best of 3 or traditional Magic that, you know, this deck could probably fit in. And, you know, control is one of those things that's definitely hard to get right for a player or a newer player, just because you don't know how to like line up your steps or line up your turns in a way, because a lot of control decks have to be kind of like multi-turn, like thinking ahead kind of things based on what your opponent does. So it is kind of interesting that they decided to make a challenger deck right off the bat to be control. But I kind of like the scheme that's going on here just based on the cards. It looks like we're playing a balance of some control spells like negates and counters, as well as playing like some enchantments to kind of take advantage of something of like Archon of Sun's Grace to get our pressure that way, because it'll give things lifelink and, you know, pump out 2/2 Pegasuses every time we play an enchantment. So I think there's an even balance there. So, you know, for a 6-card deck, I don't think it's terrible there. In the 2-drop slot, we don't actually have any 1-drop, so that's kind of like, I think, one issue. I don't really know if there's any control, you know, drops that can fit in the 1-drop, but without having any, it's kind of, you know, it's kind of on the iffy side. But two glass caskets is pretty good because it's like a way to get something off the battlefield, you know, on the early game to slow our opponent down, especially if they are playing an aggressive deck. So, you know, exiles target creature with a converted cost 3 or less until this leaves the battlefield. We got Skypipe Cleric, which is interesting here. I've never really seen anyone play this on, you know, in like a control deck. You know, most control decks don't really play a lot of spells in the beginning to disrupt a lot of the early game, and then eventually in the later game they play like the things that would create the creatures. But I like the idea that we do have a creature that would, you know, allow us to gain some life in the early game in case we're getting beaten down. As well as it being a 1/3, it's a pretty decent blocker to jump a lot of things and not actually die in the block. So definitely good there. We got Birth of Meletis, 4 copies to help us search for our lands. Sure, it only searches for planes, but I like the idea of thinning the deck out, getting, you know, getting some more focus on the cards that are like the things we want to draw against our opponent, as well as creating a wall to kind of chump some of the early game damage, and then gaining some life is always a good third chapter saga. Like I said before, there's negates. There is only 1 copy, which is kind of weird and awkward. I would desire, you know, maybe 2 copies at least, even if your opponent's not very non-creature spell heavy. It's just always good to have 2 copies of, because, you know, it can hit like opponent's Embercleave. That's something I would definitely want to upgrade, because 1 just doesn't feel like enough, because it's like, maybe I'll draw the negate, maybe I won't. Then we got 4 copies of Omen the Sea. Always great to have, you know, card draw in a control deck, just on the basis of helps us set up our turns, help us get a little bit deeper into our deck to maybe get to the counter spell or removal spell that we want to get. And the ability to scry helps us set up, you know, future turns, especially if our opponent's not playing anything that's going to mill anything off the top of our library. So I do like that, and then having the ability to tap 3 and scry in the later game if you really need an answer is always a good backup plan. In the 3-drop slot, we got 2 Banishing Lights. I think that's pretty good to balance with our Glass Caskets, as this can hit any other non-lane permanent our opponent may control. So, you know, anything that's very pesky that, you know, you can't hit with a Glass Casket, Banishing Light can hit Planeswalkers, hit enchantments, hit equipments, in case your opponent's playing an equipment-style deck. So definitely a good card to have, I would say, in that slot. Then we got Thirst for Meaning, which is a pretty good draw spell here. We are playing a balance of enchantments and spells, so, you know, we can draw 3 cards and discard an enchantment we may not need. So if we get rid of an Omen of the Sea, you know, we can do that and only, you know, discard 1. Worst case scenario, if we draw a lot of lands, we can always discard lands that we may not need. But I like the idea of 3 mana, draw 3 spell at instant speed is always good. Then we got 3 copies of Neutralize. You know, pretty good with the ability that it's flexible, because 3 mana we can counter target spell, or we can cycle it for 2 if we really, you know, our opponent maybe not be playing a lot of things. You know, get that card draw is always good. Sometimes there's a time where, you know, counter spells aren't what we're needed. If our opponent has a very large board out, not really playing too much because they think they're going to play into a counter spell, we can always cycle in and try to dig a little bit deeper. Then, like negate, we only have 1 copy of Saw It Come In. I would say I noticed off these lists before I really get into any of the other ones. There's not a lot of Kaldheim in them. There is a couple things from Kaldheim, but like this here is, I think, the only Kaldheim card in the deck. But, you know, 3 mana counter spell, and then we can foretell it to set up in the later turns, always pretty good. So we only have to cast 2 for it. You know, I feel like that's an okay balance with Neutralize. Maybe I would play a balance of Neutralize and Saw It Come Ins, and maybe add in 1 more copy negate. That's kind of where I feel like my balance would be, but you know, it's okay to test it out, see how it fits with the deck. I guess maybe they only needed 1, or only could put 1 in the deck. I don't really know. Next card up is Archon of Sling's Grace. Like I said before, it kind of balances with our enchantments we have in the deck. It's a fly and lifelinker. Pegasus we control have flying, which this guy makes every time we play an enchantment spell. And I think this is kind of like a good way to overwhelm your opponent with tokens if they can't deal with them or block them. You're going to gain a bunch of life and deal, you know, they're going to go down pretty quickly if they can't really deal with it. So pretty good to have 2 copies of. You know, that's something maybe to be desired if you have a little bit more, but it's okay to start off in a starter style competitive deck. Next up is Shatter the Sky. You know, this card I feel like has kind of fallen out of a lot of people's favor just in place of Doomscar, but I can understand because it's probably the cheaper of the 2, so having a way to just, you know, wipe the board for 4 mana is actually pretty good. This deck does have Doomscar in it, but it only has 1 copy of. I would say you probably want to eventually go towards Doomscar, because sure, it costs 5 mana, you know, if you play it from your hand, but you can set it up for 3 mana, which is always good as well. But, you know, besides that, it's a good board wipe to have in this style deck. Next card up is Behold the Multiverse. Okay, so there's another card from Kaldheim here. You know, 4 mana, you can draw 2 cards and scry 2 and then draw 2 cards, or you can set it up by playing it for its foretell cost. I would say that's pretty good, because you can look first before you draw 2, and then if you don't like any of those cards, you can throw them on the bottom and then take your luck about drawing 2 deeper. So I'd say that's pretty good, and then, you know, you can split the 4 mana into 2 different parts. So I would say I like this card in general in most blue decks that would need some sort of card draw. Like I said before, this card does have Doomscar. It's destroy all creatures, so essentially our other board wipe in the deck. But like I said, I like this card better than I would like Shatter the Sky, just on the basis you can foretell it on turn 2, and then when you want to deploy the board wipe, you can deploy it for 3 mana at any point. Like I said, I would probably take the Shatter the Skies and eventually evolve them into more Doomscars. But I would probably try to go for 4 board wipes to probably be good for control. Like I said, depending on how the meta is, you probably want a little bit of board wipe insurance or the ability to clear the board when you went on a higher chance of drawing it. So definitely a good card to have. This is actually very surprising. So there's 3 copies of Elspeth Conqueror's Death, which is actually pretty surprising just because the card overall is pretty good. It hits a lot of things that cost 3 or greater, so it gets rid of things that are very pesky or may have some sort of weird reoccurrence if you just try to destroy them or they put tokens on the battlefield. So I think that's pretty good. The idea here as well that non-creature spells make so we tax our opponent on the 2nd saga, and then on the 3rd saga we get to return target creature or planeswalker. I don't think this deck plays any planeswalkers, so we get to bring back any of our creatures. So if anything gets milled or destroyed, we can always bring it back and put a +1/+1 counter on it, which makes our cards that much better. So definitely a pretty good card to kind of coincide with like something like Archon of Sunspell Grace, Shark Typhoon as well. There's definitely a lot of things that we can hit that will definitely make it very good. So the next card up on the list is Shark Typhoon. This is also one of, I guess, maybe because of cost. I don't really know overall like how much a card costs and how they factored it on how many copies to put in these lists, but I like the card just in general that's flexible. You can put it on the battlefield if you slam it down for 6, and every time you play a non-creature spell, you get X blue shark creature token with fly-in equal to the spell's converted mana cost. Or, if you really need to draw a card, you can always tap it for 2 mana plus X, depending on how much mana you have open. You can draw a card that way by cycling and get an XX blue shark token based on how much you paid for X. So definitely a good flexible card to play on the battlefield, just maybe even surprise your opponent with a blocker or something like that. Then after that, we have Dream Trawler, which is a 6 mana card, 3/5, fly and lifelinker. And then whenever we draw a card, it gets +1/+0. And when we attacks, it gets to draw a card, and we can discard a card to give it hexproof. I would say that's definitely a card that fits into this style of deck. Overall, it's definitely a good backup plan to something like Archon. We do have some decent ways to draw some cards to give it that additional +1/+0. And, I would say this deck is going to be definitely a deck that has a lot of cards in its hand, so there's definitely some cards we can always discard to give it some sort of hexproof, which is definitely very good for a lot of the removal that's currently in the meta as a whole. Following that up, we have Amiria's Call, which is another, dual spell. It's a one of. It's our only mythic, I think, in the deck. But I like how it's, in the early game, if we really need that white mana, we can always put in the battlefield tapped or pay the 3 life. And then in the later game, we can always tap 7 and create 2 4/4 white angel creature tokens, and then give all our non-angel tokens indestructible. So if we decide to maybe board wipe, we can always, play this and then play the board wipe if we have that much mana. Granted, that's like 11 mana at minimum. But it's definitely good in that sense. It's definitely always good to give yourself some sort of indestructible insurance, as well as making 2 additional 4/4 white angel creatures. And the mana base is pretty straightforward. It looks like we're playing 25 lands if we can count the modal lands in the deck. Maybe 26. So it's 8 and 8, 4 temples, 4 tranquils. We have 2 copies of Skyclays, so that's 26. And then I think there is Amiria's Call. So we're playing 27, it looks like, in the deck. But I would say this is pretty decent start for a control deck. I don't think Azorius Control is the most popular control deck in the meta. I think it's like Sultai and stuff like that, like a Yorion based deck. So, but this is definitely a good start if you want to play some of your basic control style deck out there. So this next deck up, it looks very familiar if you play a lot of the meta as a whole, and that deck is Dimir Rogues. Now, unlike probably the more common popular meta style Dimir Rogues, this one's more of we're playing Zareth and trying to hit that rather than play like the Lura style where we can't play creatures bigger than 2. So you may see some creatures that you typically wouldn't see in your typical rogue deck, but overall it's still the same general principle. It's not doing anything special. In the sense that it doesn't really have cards that you may not see. It just may have fewer copies of those said cards. But overall, the deck is pretty straightforward in what it's trying to do. Play Merfolk Wind Robber for the 1-drop. If it hits our opponent, it mills them a card. We can sacrifice it if they have 8 or more to draw a card. Blood Chief's Thirst for some board removal. It's a very solid 1-cost board removal in the early game, and then in the late game, we can always pay 4 mana and get rid of whatever we want to get rid of. When it comes to creatures or even planeswalkers. Malakir Rebirth is interesting here. It's only a 1-of, I guess, maybe to kind of fit in with our mana base overall, but it's a 1-of that we can, choose a creature, lose 2 life, and then if our creature dies, we get to return to the battlefield under its control. Definitely an interesting card that you could always use to recurve something like a Thieves Guild Enforcer. So you can, get the possibility of a Death Touch, and then also you can get it back on the battlefield and make our opponent mill, additional cards. And then we got 4 copies of Thieves Guild Enforcer, which is kind of like the rogue that it makes rogues very annoying, in the sense that once you have this out, every time we play an additional rogue, we're going to make our opponent mill additional cards. And once they get 8 or more cards, it gets +2/+0 and Death Touch. So definitely very good. And at flash speed, I think it overall for a 1-drop is a very solid 1-drop in that slot. Then we got Vantress Gargoyle, which is interesting in the sense of, it being in this style of deck. It's a 2-mana 5/4. Though it has some interesting things here, so it's not too strong. It can't attack unless our defendant player has 7 or more cards, which isn't very hard for rogues unless they're playing a lot of escape. And it can't block unless you have 4 more cards in hand. The one thing I will say that this deck doesn't have is a lot of card draw. So it doesn't play things like Into the Story, so we're not going to really replenish our hand. But, I mean, maybe we're not going to dump our whole hand onto the battlefield immediately. So we can use that as a blocker in the early game if we have a lot of cards in hand. So there is that, I guess. And then we can also tap it and mill and make each player mill a card. So maybe getting that additional 1 card into the graveyard to make our Thieves Guild or any of our other rogues, triggers activate. So it's an interesting card here, I would say, in the deck overall as a whole. 3 copies is pretty solid. Then we got Eliminate, 2 copies of, which I think is very interesting when we look at all the removal. It's like they did like an even, removal cost. So we have 2 Eliminates, which destroys target creature with our Planeswalker convertment cost 3 or less. We have 2 Cartless Axe, and then we have 2 Bloodtree Thirst, which I think is, like, I guess, 6 removal spells, and they each kind of like have different, drawbacks to them. But I think they each can fit in here, and I guess depending on how the game is going, you have some options on how you want to deal with your opponent's creatures. Then we got Drown in the Loch, which is the spell for, like, it was made for this deck like a year prior. In the fact that for 2 mana, 1 blue, 1 black, we can convert counter target spell with the convertment cost less than the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. So essentially, once we start getting our mill engine on, we can almost counter anything in their deck. And then on the same time too, we can destroy target creature with the convertment cost equal to the cards in that player's graveyard. So also very good. By turn 6, or not even turn 6, by like turn 2, turn 3, we can pretty much essentially kill a lot of things or counter a lot of things in the deck opponent possibly will play, unless they're playing something that's really, really large. But overall, very, very good card in that sense, because it is very diverse, and for 2 mana, I mean, there's really not much of a drawback for this card in this deck. Then we got 4 copies of Sorin Thought Thief, which essentially is our rogue lord in a way, because it gives all our rogues +1/+0 if we have 8, if that opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. And then whenever 1 or more rogues attack, each opponent mills 2 cards, so it has an additional effect whenever our rogues attack as well. And it has flash. Why not? Why not give a rogue flash? And somehow flying. I don't know how rogues fly, but I guess it's flying out of the air. I don't really know, but it flies in the air, and yeah, it's annoying, but it works for the deck, and it's very good. We have Black Bloom Rogue, which is a 3-drop 2/3. It has Menace. It gets +3/+0 as long as each opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. This is probably one of those rogues that's a little bit more on the budget, but I can understand why it's in here. A lot of the rogues will mill, and it can also flex into a land if we need a land or black mana. So I guess it has some of that flexibility, but I guess it's okay to have a possibility of having a 5/3 Menace. It makes it hard for our opponent to block our chump if they don't really want to kill their creature. So overall, pretty good rogue for the deck. I mean, it's a little awkward, but it works for what it is. Then we have 3 Nighthawk Scavengers. It's a great card. I don't think it sees a lot of play because there is a lot of removal in the format, but I think when it does get on the battlefield, it is something we want to get rid of in the mid game to late game, just because cards have been put into your opponent's graveyard, and it gets +1. It gets its power equal to 1 plus the number of card types among your opponent's cards in their graveyard. So if your opponent plays a very diverse range of spells, lands, things that may have been milled into their graveyard, this thing can be very big and very annoying fairly quickly. And it has flying, death touch, and lifelink, so we can we can kill a lot of creatures by just chumping, or we can gain a lot of life if the power is very high. So definitely a good card, I would say. We got 1 copy of Rankle. Yet again, mythics look like they're only like a 1 of in the deck. But for what it is and what the deck is, it works. Whenever it deals damage to a player, we can choose one of the 3 options. Make each player discard a card, each player loses 1 life and draws a card, or each player sacrifices a creature. So it's very diverse on what it does. It's another flyer. There's a lot of flying in the deck, so it definitely goes over a lot of things that could definitely block it. And I like it. Maybe I would say more copies of, maybe 2 of, just because it's you maybe want to draw it some of the time, but not all the time kind of thing. It is also legendary. But for what it is, I guess it works for the deck. We got Zareth, Santa the Trickster. This is one of those cards that's very interesting with Rogues in the sense that in the beginning when Rogues first came out, this is kind of what, you know, Rogue decks built around before they swapped to like a Luris more mill style. But I like the idea that you can flash it in, which for 5 mana, which is not bad. At the same time too, you can return an unblocked creature we control to its owner's hand. We get to put this guy on the battlefield tapped and attacking, and whenever he deals combat damage to a player, you may put that permanent card on from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. So from all the mill we've been doing, we can kind of target a lot of things or target what we really want and put it on the battlefield and use their own card against, you know, themselves. But overall, a very interesting card. I do like this list off the bat. I do kind of like this style of Rogues more than like the focus on the mill. This doesn't play any of those cards that mill a lot of cards, but it does mill some to kind of get to some of the triggers for some of the cards there. And the mana base is pretty straightforward in what it's trying to do. You know, we got 8 islands, 9 swamps, 4 dismals, 4 temples, and then there's some modal lands kind of mixed in there to kind of, you know, fix our mana that way. Though I would say this is more on the black side than the blue side, so I understand why there's more black mana in the deck than the overall blue mana. But, you know, there's a good chance for us to hit either mana color choices because, you know, there's 8 of these, 8 islands. And then just at the same time, too, it's pretty even. And the curve is overall pretty good. I mean, yet again, it's another deck that rounds around 2, so it's a very aggressive deck. Moving on to the last deck, I mean, yet again, another deck that you're probably very familiar of, that you probably can't get enough of when it comes to playing anything in the meta, and that is mono red. I mean, essentially, this is like most mono red lists out there. It is slightly different in a certain sense because in certain curves, we're playing different cards than you normally would see. This deck does play Hellhound. It does play Fervent Champion, both solid 1-drop slots in mono red. You know, he gets +2/+2 every time we play a land. Fervent Champion give another knight we control +1/+0. It also has first strike. It makes abilities we have to activate a target 3 less to cast. Has haste. You know, it's definitely a very solid 1-drop slot. So then we got Shock for some target removal. We got Spikefield Hazard yet again for some target removal. Also possibility of playing in the land battlefield tapped if we really need the mana. But overall, a very good spot removal to get rid of like little pesky like small things and exile them instead of, you know, throwing them in the graveyard. Now the 2-drop slot's where it gets interesting. So we've Kargan the Intimidator, 4 copies of 3/1. The one thing I would say off the bat, you may be wondering where is the Robber of the Rich, and I'm actually very surprised they didn't include any copies of, but I do like that they kind of went away from it. But I guess this more has more spot removal in that sense. So we play 2 copies of Kargan the Intimidator, so 3/1 for 2 mana. Cowards can't block warriors. We're not playing a warrior deck, so I mean that ability is okay for Kargan, I guess, but it's not going to really help in a lot of our other creatures because our other creatures are more diverse in their creature types. But I like the idea that he has, you know, a couple different copies, a couple different abilities you can choose for 1 mana. And you can only choose one of them that hasn't been chosen this turn, so you can only do it 1 at a time. So you give a +1/+1. You can give creature becomes a coward until end of turn, so it can't block Kargan. And then for another one, you can give him trample in a turn. So if you have another warrior or Kargan, you can give him trample. So whatever damage he does it over the creature if they, you know, don't have a lot of toughness. But overall, very good 2-drop that you see in some mono red decks. Sometimes you don't. Depending on the mono red deck, I guess it's depending on if you like this card or you don't. Next card up is Rimrock Knight, which is I think which is a card that's definitely a staple in most red decks because of its pump ability for the 1 mana instant speed, and as well as a decent for 2 mana 3/1 unblock, can't be blocked, but you can't block. But you know, overall it coincides and works well with the Fervent Champion because it is also a knight. So it can get the additional +1/+0, which makes it puts more pressure on your opponent at the 2-drop slot. So definitely a pretty solid card there. Then we got Royal the Eruption, which I find interesting here. So it's a 2 mana, deal 3 damage to any target, as well as for 5 additional mana, you can make it deal 5 damage to any target instead. So, you know, it's definitely tough. I don't know if we're ever going to spend 7 mana to do the 5 damage with this card, but I like the idea that, you know, for 2 mana we got 3 damage to any target. Sure, it's not instant speed, but for 2 damage, or for 3 damage to any target, I think that's pretty solid for 2 mana. So I mean, it is very good spot removal for being 3 mana. Next card up is Shatterskull Smashin'. It's yet again another board removal. This is actually very surprising, as this is actually a 2 of in this deck. So we're already playing 2 copies, which is I feel like more than any other deck. And I like how it's like another board removal, spot removal, as well as a land if we want to be very aggressive in case we draw it early in the early game. But I like the idea that it's the 2 mana tap X, and then we can divide X as two amongst 2 creatures and deal damage to each one. And then if it's 6 or more, it deals twice as damage, which I found out in Arena, if you ever play this card, which I didn't know when I first played it, that you actually have to tap the additional X. You just can't tap the 6, and then it'll do it automatically once you disperse the damage. So you would have to actually, you know, disperse the 12 damage overall. So just as a little heads up if you do play this card in Arena. But yeah, I mean, I like it here. It's a very good card. You know, we do have a decent amount of removals, but I mean, it kind of fits in that removal curve in the later game when we have maybe more additional mana to play. And of course, in the 3-drop slot, we got Bone Crusher Giant. I mean, it wouldn't be a mono red deck or a deck that plays any red and not have Bone Crusher Giant. 4 copies as well. So, you know, 3 mana, 4/3. It gets targeted by a spell. It's going to do 2 damage to that spell's controller. And then in the early game, we can always play the 2 mana and stomp our opponent's face or creature that's in the way, and the damage can be prevented. It's just a very solid card to have in the deck. Then Annex as well. I mean, it's, yet again, if we're playing mono red, Annex is like the card because this thing can definitely get beefed up pretty quickly, and just throw an Embercleave on it. It gets very aggressive. But a very solid card yet again. If they can't exile it and they just destroy it, we're gonna get tokens, and if they destroy any of our other creatures, we're gonna get even more tokens. So it definitely makes it hard for board removal unless it's exile removal. So overall, pretty good card. We got 3 Tor Brands, which also very solid. I mean, this deck, as much as it's not like the typical mono red deck, to me it seems very competitive for what it is. 4 mana, 2/4. If any of our red sources do damage to a permanent or opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2. So everything we have in our deck on the earlier slots are just gonna do 2 more additional damage. Makes all our removal that much stronger. So I kind of understand why maybe they went a little bit on the higher removal side. It makes, for 2 mana, you can do 5 damage to any target. This does 3 damage. Shock does 4 damage. So definitely very good. And having 3, I think, is the perfect number because it's legendary. So you don't want to draw too many, but at the same time, too, you want to make sure you kind of draw it in the way. And then yet again, like I said, the red deck is very interesting. So I feel like in a weird way, Wizards is very skewed towards red. And they have 1 copy of Embercleave. Though I personally would say this deck needs more Embercleave than the 1 copy, just because you want to hit Embercleave as being the game finisher. So I would say that's definitely an area to upgrade, but it's a card that's very mono red in its way because the more aggressive we are, the cheaper it gets and makes our attacks just that much more damage into our opponent's face. But overall, very solid card. I can't say any more that you probably haven't heard about Embercleave. It's gonna be one of those things that when it rotates out and it goes away, I'm so happy, just because I don't have to worry about someone attacking aggressively and getting Embercleave to the face. But you know, good card. And then, like they said, the mana base isn't, you know, super crazy. It's 18 in the lands because we have some modal cards in the early game. But I mean, it works because the deck itself is not super expensive. I think yet again, this is another deck that averages 2. So if we have like 4 or 5 lands, we're pretty set. And then we got 2 copies of Castle Embereth. Only deck out of all of them to play Castle. I'm very surprised the mono green one didn't because of the Castle for green is actually very good as well. And then we got 16 copies of 16, you know, Mountains. I mean, overall, I'm fairly impressed with the deck. I'm sure the sideboard's just as good. But guys, if you like this video, let me know in the comments below which one's maybe your favorite. If you are going to go out and possibly purchase this, let me know. If you do play physical Magic, I know a lot of us play from home, so there's the likely chance that most of us won't buy these decks. But if I wanted to get back into Standard and I haven't actually bought a lot of physical Magic, I'd probably start here, and then I have an understanding of where the meta is, so I can probably, you know, tweak the decks to kind of fit that meta. But for the price, and I think it's a good value. With that being said, guys, I'm gonna have all the lists for these decks down below. It's probably gonna be a link to the actual Wizards website that actually has each deck. I don't think the import tool works, or there isn't one on the Wizard website, because I tried to use whatever it looked like with the arena symbol and it wouldn't import it to the deck. But I mean, it only took me like, you know, 10 minutes to probably copy each deck or all the decks to the arena client. If you want to test them out, give them a spin and see which one you like the best. But until next time, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to know post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But I'll see you in the next video.